on one hand and the consumer on the other, and took advantage of both. Where are we today? 4 packers control 85% of the market, and we've got a stronger partnership between the packer and retailer than we had then, with far more concentration in retail and meat packing both. And so it's a bigger job today because big money represents political power. And to the extent that money is political power, we have to address that. You know, I've talked about for 25 years how, you know, we've got to take the money out of politics, the big corporate money out of politics. And then, of course, we get Citizens United, which put it right back in a big way. And so that's something we have to look at. But that only will happen with the citizen working on it, the consumer and the producer working together.
You know, I've kind of lucked into the last year and a half, I've been able to moderate a Facebook group, and it's called Grassroots USA Beef. If you're not a member, please join. And that's a shameless plug right there. But what that has given me the opportunity, there's about 91,000 members, and by and large, it's just consumers. They are folks that want to know more about where the beef comes from on their plate. And that has given me a perception and a perspective that I did not have prior, that people want to know the story behind the product. They care. I don't know that as producers sometimes we understand how important it is that they want to have that nutritious, safe product, and they're willing to put forth the time and the effort to learn more about it. I think sometimes we think that people just, you know, go to the grocery store, throw it on a plate for their families, and I don't think that's accurate. You know, I think people want to know the story behind the product. They want to know that they're supporting rural communities, that they're supporting ag. They like that there's a connection between that family farm. As we've seen with COVID here the last year, I think a lot more people are looking to buy their beef directly, and I think they're establishing that connection, and I think that's very important. Senate Bill 2716 is the mandatory country of origin labeling bill. If you want to know where your beef is coming from, what country it originated in, you really need to take the time and the effort to reach out to your legislators, to talk to them, to let them know that that is an important issue to you. I think most people don't even realize that the product that they could be buying at their grocery store is from a foreign country, Mike. I think the idea of that just blows their mind. I, not too long ago, had an opportunity where we did kind of a branded beef promotion at my place. And after that happened, I had people in our local community come up and told me that they'd been in a restaurant and had bought beef from that branded place and just assumed that it was my beef. Because I think it makes sense to people that when they're driving into their town, they see cattle out grazing, so those are clearly the cattle that are in their grocery store. And when you realize and they find out that that's not necessarily the case, they're very concerned and they're very mad about that.
That's right. We are deceiving the public on where their food comes from. But when you've got the Batista Brothers Mafia from Brazil, who supports Colorado State University with $12 million in their new meat lab, and it goes clear back to the Montfort chair, with Montfort, ConAgra, Swift, and now it's JBS, the biggest meat packer in the world. You got JBS, who's big in the poultry business, so now we've got the other land grants that are more in the poultry areas, all controlled by these big multinational conglomerates. And the other thing that I think we have to really be careful about is distinguishing the difference between a big meat packer like an IBP was back in those 70s, 80s, and 90s, and a conglomerate. A conglomerate can put a big guy out of business like IBP. Tyson bought IBP. No cattleman would have ever bet on that. But it was only 5 years later, after that 1996 governor's cattle conference in South Dakota, where Bob Peterson blamed the cattle producer for all the low prices, that Tyson bought that company out. And so when we think about rebuilding systems and models that are going to serve both the producer and the consumer, we have to be very, very aware of that predator in the market, and that's the conglomerate. The conglomerate like the Cargill, the JBS, the Marfrig from the other big packer from Brazil, the Tyson. I mean, they can make money all day long in the poultry business and put any competitor out of business that comes along in the beef business. But the other thing that I'm really proud of today, among the consumer side, among the producer side of the industry, is the willingness and really the bravery of certain individuals that are willing to speak out. Back in 1996, it was Johnny Smith and Herman Schumacher. And they could gather anywhere from 800 to 1,500 people to a gathering in at either Pierre or Harriet or anywhere up and around South Dakota. And these guys were the sale barn operators. And they had a vital interest in making sure people on the land got their fair share of the consumer dollar. And today we have Steve Stratford that's well-spoken, extremely well-spoken on the issues. We got John Campbell. We've got sale barns today that do have a voice, that they can put the word out to the producer side of the industry, which has really been a tough sell because so many producers listen to NCBA, funded with checkoff dollars, putting out false messaging that there's really no problem. And so I am very, very grateful for a guy like a Steve Stratford, a John Campbell, Justin Tupper. There's others out there that are now willing to speak out, and I just hope they'll continue.
Yeah, I hope this doesn't offend you, Mike, because I've never actually said it in front of you, although I have referred to you as an old lion a lot of times. And what that is, there are some folks that 20 years ago, 40 years ago started screaming. And what they said was that the industry was on a track, that there was an inevitable train wreck that was coming. And you probably are aware of this, Mike. A lot of people laughed. They made fun. They said that they were radicals. They said they were crazies. They said that they were rebel rousers. And you know what happened? They turned out to be right. They were right that this industry was becoming consolidated. They were correct that we were going to have processors that took over too much control. And when they had that control, they were going to start putting the grind to us. They knew that these processes, that these packers were owning cattle. They knew that these folks were going to be fraudulent with the consumer, that they were mislabeling their product. And they knew that cattle producers were going to have to leave the industry and that rural America was going to be hollowed out. And as we sit here today, everybody knows that that is now the case. And so I am also very thankful. And probably my biggest complaint, when people ask me what's wrong with the cattle industry, I always say the same thing, and it always isn't the thing people think. Cattle producers are too coward. There are not enough of us that are screaming and speaking out. And I think you're right. I think as time goes on, we're getting more people that step up to the microphone. Steve Stratford and Mike, who I've been able to visit with the last 2 days, I think they're a little bit an exception to the rule. But guys like me that come up to a microphone, I'm not a strong intellect. I don't have some wonderful perception of this industry that is hidden only to me. What I do have is I have the ability to come up here and speak and say the things that people already know in their heads and they already know in their hearts. And those things are that this industry is broken and that this is our final stand. If we don't get it fixed and we don't get it fixed now and we don't do it correctly, there isn't any tomorrow. I mean, we're to a point now where we already don't have critical mass in this industry anymore going forward.
And Adam, we can't settle for some weak legislative solutions. We have to break them up. And the model, the recipe, is from 1921. You simply step in, and hey, if Tyson's got 11 plants, that becomes 11 meat packers. You go to the other packers, and those become independently owned. But at the same time, unlike in 1921, we've got to break up the retailer and food service power at the same time. So it's a government thing. We can't do anything about it on our own. We've got to have a lot of support. We need it, like you rightly said, the consumer has got to be informed. And Adam, when you talk about the cowboys, you got to know that some of them are plugged into the absolute wrong information and trust it. And I'm sorry, but it's like being brainwashed. They can't get over it. And so let's just drag them along and hopefully increase their income dramatically in the years to come, and they become a great part of their communities. Yeah, sure, they didn't get it, but that's okay. We can still work with the consumer, because the consumer wants a resilient, safe, and sustainable food system that won't let them down during an outbreak like COVID.
You know, as we're going back and forth here, there's things that pop in my mind, and I want to make sure that I don't let something that you said earlier escape everyone. When we're talking about JBS being a mafia, we're not using hyperbole. These people are crooks. They are proven crooks. And I guess let's go into some detail about that.
Well, you know, the Batista brothers, they got in a lot of trouble in Brazil for bribing government officials. Up to 2,000 government officials and meat inspectors. They put rotten meat into the market. And every country in the world said, no, we don't want your rotten meat, except for the U.S. Al Almanza, as the administrator of Food Safety Inspection Service under USDA. The guy in charge of food safety allowed that meat to come into our country for 90 days. Finally, Sonny Perdue was appointed Ag Secretary, and of course, our organizations that we're members of, we're putting all kinds of pressure on USDA to stop the importation of that rotten meat. So Sonny Perdue told Al Almanza, look, you're going to have to stop bringing that stuff in. His response was to quit, resign from USDA after being there nearly 40 years, or around 40 years, full retirement. He could leave. He went to work for JBS as their global food safety guy. And this is the revolving door we've seen for years. But these criminal corporations, and just, I don't care if you're talking about Cargill, JBS, Tyson, Marfrig, they've all got the felony counts. And my question is, and what we just talked about bribing government officials is just part of it. You know, when JBS got fined the $3 billion for bribing those officials and giving special treatment on money that was available through the banks in Brazil, they were fined this money. Well, in the following days after that fine, they dropped the price in Brazil to those cattle producers. And so don't we have a lot in common with producers of other countries, as we're all being leveraged against one another by these same criminal corporations that roam the globe searching for the hungriest people that will work the cheapest and extracting wealth in huge amounts, and they continue to do so. So this has to be stopped. But these are absolutely criminal corporations. And if you look at corporate charters, you don't have to approve a corporate charter on a criminal company. In fact, you can withdraw the corporate charter from a criminal company. And I'm asking the Colorado Attorney General, Phil Weiser, why don't you withdraw JBS's corporate charter? They operate, their headquarters are in the state of Colorado. Why don't you withdraw that? They are proven criminals. They've got felony count after felony count. I mean, they cheat on the weights on carcasses. They're in Denver last week. They're in Denver at a criminal trial for fixing the price on poultry. These are absolutely criminals. In fact, back in when we were suing IBP and it was opening day trial, and I was interviewed by an AP reporter, and I said, look, these guys are nothing but gangsters, thugs, and thieves. You know, they stand on our neck and pick the consumer's pocket, and that got printed in the national news. And so I got a letter before I testified and went to the witness stand, I got a letter from the IBP attorneys, and it said, you got to withdraw that false and defamatory statement. So I went to the hotel that night and got with my attorney, David Domina, and we prepared a response. And so basically what we did is we defined, how is IBP a thug? How is IBP a gangster? How is IBP a thief? And we listed all the ways that they were that, exactly. And we gave it back to the attorneys. Never heard another word, haven't heard a word since. But that's on my blog. If you want to check it out at MikeCalicrate.com, look, just put in gangster and it'll pop right up. But truly, these companies, the public should be protected from these criminals that are operating as corporations, extracting the wealth from every sector of our society.
You know, going a little different direction here, Mike, I want to talk a little bit about what's happened to the cattle in the last 40 years. You know, I make my living by making choices about trying to raise cattle that, for me, that reach the environment that we live in, that also can produce a product. I'm also very worried about the maternal aspect of it. And what it seems like to me is over the last 40 years, because we have been trying to satisfy this packer monopoly, we have done everything we can to really ruin the nation's cow herd. In the Angus breed, we get to talking about carcass merit, and when we do that, sometimes we forget that we need to have cattle that are able to navigate around pastures. We give up our feet and legs. We start to talk about, bigger cattle. We've gotten to the point where guys are wanting to kill 1,600-pound cattle. That's in our 14-inch rainfall country that I run cattle in. We've gotten these cattle too big. We've lost the fleshing ability. And it's somewhat directly, it's somewhat indirectly, but what's happened is there's so little competition that everyone is trying to fit into this little bitty box so they can make a little bit of profit. And consequently, we've taken away a lot of the, things that were pretty obvious and pretty natural to these cattle. Get to wondering about, in terms of being humane producers and stewards of our livestock. Mike, what have we done?
Back in the early 90s to 1996, when Bob Peterson was speaking in public, he said flat out, we care more about quantity than we do quality. We're going to cook your food for you. But you know why he was going to cook your food? Is it because of the fact they were boxing that beef and they were packaging the E. coli 0157H7 with the meat. And that was Jack in the Box. The ConAgra recall of 20 million pounds out of Greeley, Colorado, before that was JBS. This was kicking their butt. And so now they're saying, well, we're going to cook your meat for you. That'll fix that E. coli. Then we can really run those chains at a fast rate. The whole idea that we were going to sell on a grid and get paid for quality was nothing but a lie and a fool's game, because that always moved. Paying a premium for a meat packer is a 4-letter word. Premium is a 4-letter word to a meat packer. And so they get you off on this tangent to produce a bigger animal. Oh, well, now we're going to discount for the over 950 weight carcasses, and oh, we're going to discount for the 4s. And that offset all of the extra choice cattle that you were able to produce through whatever genetic selection you had. So that was always a moving target, and it's always been nothing but a fool's game. And because of a lack of real messaging back from the consumer that wants that quality, that wants to take that bite of steak and just go, wow, involuntary celebration. It tastes so good, it's tender, it bursts with flavor. That's what they want. We haven't produced it because that's not what the meat packer wanted. And that's not what the big retailer wanted, because they wanted something cheap that they could make more margin on and higher volumes. It's all about the volumes. And the other thing that really drives a lot of this decision making is the fast food industry that wants cheap ground beef. Well, cheap ground beef will come from extra fat that you and I put on finished cattle beyond where they should have been fed, mixed with cheap imported product. The lean that we get out of South America and Australia, the very low quality product that we import. And so we've really been played for fools. And we have been displaced in this country by foreign supplies that have basically left us out of the market. And so we do have to address imports. In fact, that ought to be one of the necessary reforms we're talking about here, is we need to really reduce these imports and rebuild our cow herd. We can't feed America. We haven't produced enough beef in America since before 1950. We have not produced enough beef in America to feed Americans. And so why are we losing nearly half our calf producers and 87,000 feedlots? It's market power. It's abusive market power. It's monopoly power, and it needs broken up.
And people need to paying attention. Right now, we are killing off cows at rates we've never seen before. And yes, some of that's because of some drought up in the Northwest, but you look at some of the numbers coming out of the Southeast, we're also killing cows there. And I contend that guy's going out of business. There's dispersal sales every week. Want to kind of move the conversation in a little bit different direction. You mentioned it in the video you did earlier. Let's talk about the checkoff, and let's do a little bit of history and then where it has actually landed.
I got reminded just this week. I was looking at an old VHS tape of the grassroots gathering in South Dakota. There was about 1,200 people or so went to that, and I was invited to go up and speak at it. And that was in the spring of 1996. And NCBA had just been formed like months earlier at their annual winter convention in San Antonio, which I was there. And the big deal is that they merged the National Cattlemen's Association with the checkoff, to where the National Cattlemen's Association would then control the checkoff, essentially. And they changed the name to the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, and they invited the meat packers to be on the board, along with Allied Industries, which was your vaccine guys, your drug guys, you know, others in the industry, big corporations. So now they got seats on the board, so they could start helping develop policy under the new NCBA. The other thing the NCBA decided is we need to develop a long-range plan. And the long-range plan was basically a model designed after the poultry industry. And we were going to basically vertically integrate the beef industry like we did poultry, to where you'd just become a serf on your own place. And that honestly is what's happened, regardless of whether you thought it was a good idea or not. It was forced on us. But the big deal is they captured that $80-some million a year collected through the beef checkoff, and they used it to promote the meat packing interests, the big retailer interests. They used it to indirectly control Congress, lobbying Congress for rules and laws and legislation that benefited the monopoly developing bigger and stronger and to where they are today. The beef checkoff has been used as a weapon against the very people who pay it. And I've always said I'd be in favor of reforming the checkoff and putting it to work like it's supposed to be. You know, I mean, we ought to be fighting fake meat. That's a massive fraud on the public. Fake meat is not good in any way you can't even think of a way that fake meat is a good idea. And we ought to be opposing that, but not just buying members of Congress to vote against cattle producers' interests. And that's really exactly what we've been doing. And you notice, Adam, when the merger occurred, we had already seen the Kansas Livestock Association take over that Kansas Beef Council. And basically, what Kansas Livestock Association did to the Kansas Beef Council is what NCBA did with the checkoff. They captured those dollars. And what you saw right away was executive pay, you know, out the roof. You know, big money to D-likes and the executives of the Kansas Livestock Association. So the Kansas Livestock Association, the Texas Cattle Feeders Association, those are the guys that really were a big part of the overall capture of the beef checkoff by the National Cattlemen's Association. And there's no way they can explain what they've done. You know, this idea that we're going to force implanted meat into the European Union, and that being supported with checkoff dollars. And they'll say, yeah, but the checkoff is separate. There's a firewall between the checkoff and the lobbying side or the policy side. Well, really, the checkoff is what you're paying your bills with. It's over 80% of your total income. Don't tell me that. There's a firewall. And so the checkoff has orchestrated the whole model that we have today that has reduced your share of the consumer food dollar by $1,500 a head. Now just think, if the cow-calf and the feeding sector had that $1,500 a head, then that could trickle back down to farmers and ranchers and rural communities, how different America would look. And I got to tell you that checkoff was key in that theft of that $1,500.
You know, Mike, I might not look like it as I sit here, but I'm a big nerd. And so I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out where checkoff money goes. And if you've ever done, and I would challenge anyone, if you support the beef checkoff, then you go do the research and you try to figure out where that money goes. And once you get down that rabbit hole as deep as I know you're going to get and look back up, you need to know that at the very local level, a 4-H club, a church, if you couldn't do a better accounting than that, if your school board wasn't audited any better on the finances than that, you as an individual would shut them down. And then we're talking about an organization that has millions of dollars. And it's easy to explain that somebody broke the law, but we've seen multiple cases of actual embezzlement where checkoff employees have stolen millions of dollars over the course of years before someone realized that that money was gone. To me, that is so blatant that there is misappropriation of these funds. And I'm like you, Mike, you know, this firewall, I mean, who are we kidding? We know that that is how, and you know, we are all business people. We understand how they're doing it. You know, they have staff that their salaries are split, you know, between NCBA and checkoff. They have buildings that they split, NCBA and checkoff. Well, what that allows them to do is NCBA is able to have buildings and staff that they wouldn't otherwise be able to afford. It's corrupt. It's obviously evil. And then we get to what's really at the root of why we need to. And I'm like you, I would love to see a reform checkoff, but unfortunately for us, the way that that bill was written in 1985, it's very challenging to just make changes. We about have to end the checkoff and then come back up with something new. You know, it seems so inappropriate that an organization would continually write policy that's against the policy that would be in my best interest. There is a lot of cattle legislation right now, Mike. I'd like to kind of go through each piece of it with you and give your opinion to people. I mentioned earlier the mandatory country of origin labeling, which is Senate Bill 2716. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, the country of origin labeling, you know, we repealed that a while back with the WTO decision that Canada and Mexico would be harmed by our country of origin labeling. And this was really the meat packers at the table. It wasn't Canada. It wasn't Mexico. It was the meat packers in those places. And those multinationals, like we talked about, JBS and Cargill is now in Canada, and they totally control the market up there. And so really it was a decision, the WTO made a decision based upon those corporate interests. And it was absolutely flawed. In fact, I've said many years ago that the WTO has got to go, because that is the globalization model that's corporate controlled, that extracts wealth from all around the world, and you know, searches the world for the hungriest people that'll work the cheapest, selling the product in the highest consuming markets. That's the WTO. And I think it should go. And I'm not saying we shouldn't trade. I'm just saying that we ought to be able to trade more as individuals with individuals in other countries, and do it on a mutually beneficial basis, instead of this one where we go in and crush those Brazilian producers to get cheap meat, so Tyson can have cheap hamburgers, so McDonald's can have cheap hamburgers. So the country of origin labeling is a no-brainer. We should have it. It absolutely is in the best interests of U.S. producers. But hey, it's in the interest of all producers, because the U.S. sets the global price. So whatever the price is in the U.S., which is the highest and best consuming market in the world, the more Canada benefits, the more Mexico benefits. And so we've just got the wrong people at the table making these decisions. But for these legislators, like our Kansas, Roger Marshall, and before that it was Pat Roberts and Jerry Moran, for them to side with the meat packer global interests over the people in Kansas is not right. They are not representing the consumer or the producer in their state. And to be running for fear, crawling under the table about $1 billion, you know, penalty for implementing country of origin labeling, you can't be serious. You know, you lose that much every few weeks in this ridiculous low market that we have now as a result of consumers not knowing where their food comes from. But I wouldn't put a whole lot of value or depend a whole lot on country of origin labeling fixing a lot. I think they'll say, oh, well, be careful what you ask for, unintended consequences. This is coming from a monopoly that can do anything they want to you. They can take cattle to 50 cents tomorrow if they want to. They aren't probably going to, because there'd be too much pushback, but they can punish. The monopoly has the power to punish. And so, yeah, you get country of origin labeling. That's a nice step. That's great. That's a nice step. We should do it. Then we have to police it and make sure they're actually doing it. But what we really need is to break up their market power.
You know, I'm going back to mandatory country of origin labeling. I always throw out a couple things that people don't realize. Right now, if you're in Canada, they label their beef where it's originated from. If you go into Japan or you go into China, of course, not only do they label American beef in those stores, there's great big banners, there's big booths there. They want people to know.
Kelly asked the question, and he said, asked me if I'd talked to Jerry Moran. Well, I talked to his staff was it a week ago or a week and a half ago? We had what we called a virtual fly-in. And so in talking with Jerry Moran's staff, they're nice. They're very accommodating. In the virtual thing, they were in their office, they were having a cup of coffee, they were relaxed. We weren't standing out in the hallway, in one of the congressional buildings. And so it was really a good way to have a conversation. But actually, they weren't committal. They weren't going to commit to anything. But they were well-trained, well-versed, and they really were okay to talk to. The better question, Kelly, is how did we get along with Roger Marshall's staff? And it was like a KLA graduate. He was there saying, well, he was an attorney. He wanted to make sure we all knew he was an attorney. And the other young lady that was there in the virtual Zoom call was on her phone all the time and was just perturbed that she even had to be on the call. And of course, Roger Marshall took Pat Roberts' place, and along with that took Pat Roberts' positions on ignoring meat packer concentration. You don't want country of origin labeling. You don't want mandatory price reporting. You don't want any of these things that would help a producer. And so this young man that was the attorney staffer for Marshall said, well, my attorney mind, my legal mind tells me that we really can't break up the meat packers. And this labeling thing, I don't think that's really going to help us. And it was just so offensive to be on that call and to see this guy talking the way that he did. Because most people are far more diplomatic than that. Jerry Moran's staff would be more diplomatic. They'd say they wouldn't at least say they weren't interested in breaking up the packers. They would say they'd look into it, perhaps, and then never do it. But Marshall's staff was in your face. We ain't doing nothing about this.
Are you aware of the fact that hitting in my face is just what I want? I want the one that back clicks out there. That's the one I want to draw. So if you want to get in my face, I'll sure as hell accommodate your ass. And I can get it where they're not quite as smooth.
Yeah,
So
but Kelly, absolutely.
I'm gonna run a spur in the son of a bitch, and let's see if he'll stop.
But Kelly, yeah, you can spur them and you can rip them and you can make them wrong because they know they're wrong. They already know they're wrong. But for them to change their position, it's going to take the voters, and the voters honestly need to vote them out.
Donald Trump got into office by being the tough guy, by being the one that got them shirts, step right in there and mix it up. And I'm sick and tired of the meaty mouth, lily liver, lean weenie spine fags we got doing everything.
Yeah, we got no representation in Congress. None. And Adam, it gets back to some of these bills that we've been talking about. They aren't strong enough. They just aren't strong enough. But the risk we run in getting country of origin labeling, in getting the 5014, which basically protects the big feeders' interests so they don't lose their place on the captive supply line. Yeah, it's going to knock off some of them, but it won't knock off the biggest ones. That doesn't fix it. And the problem with passing those pieces of legislation is, as a producer, you're going to say, okay, we've made progress. And as a consumer, you're going to say, okay, hey, the problem's fixed. Now we can go on about our business. No way, you're not even close. You've got to break them up. And we don't have people in Congress today without, I'll tell you, who your biggest friend in Congress is? And a lot of cowboys can't get their head around this. It's Cory Booker. Cory Booker and his Farm Reform Act has got more solutions for cowboys than anybody on the Hill. And Cory Booker was out there in New Jersey as a mayor in New Jersey. He became a senator, and he became very interested in the food system issues. He's also a vegetarian, so now you got to like him even more, right? So he's a vegetarian. So he makes a trip to Kansas and goes to David Frang and Jenny Frang's farm. Couldn't believe it. David was really nervous about having this big guy from New Jersey come out to the farm, and he finally allowed it to happen. But he was so impressed with Cory Booker when he sat at their kitchen table and said, this is what I'm working for. I am working for you to increase your income at the farm and ranch gate because we need stewards back on the land, as you've said, Adam. We need husbandmen back on the land again. We need people that care about the land to be on the land, not just big corporations strip mining it.
How about the 30-30
I don't know a whole lot about the 30-30 rule, but I do know
Legislation always making that shit funny to do.
they're always throwing something at you to piss you off and to keep you from addressing the real problem of meat packer monopoly that's picking your pocket every single day.
With taxation and regulation. And they want the land. They gotta have the land to pay the rent, and they gotta take your guns first.
And you know, we talk about the USDA and their inspection. That is all about how to not have small local regional plants. Because think about it, you're a journeyman butcher. You can do 10 head of cattle a day, hanging up the carcasses in a cooler. USDA rolls in and said, wait a minute, you got to do your paperwork. Here's a guy that's good with a knife that they're going to put a pencil in his hand. Well, his first reaction is, no. I've never had a food safety problem, and I'm not going to have one going forward, and I'm not going to do your paperwork. So they cancel any request they had for a grant of inspection, and they just keep killing custom meat. But then they don't have access to cross state lines. Then they don't have access to get that retail price, that $4,400 a head.
However, how's it working with meth?
Yeah, I don't know how it's working with
Well,
that.
they don't have inspection, I'll guarantee you that. Seems
Yeah.
to have a
But-
profitable
but-
business going on.
But the big monopoly power in Washington knows all about regulation and what a barrier it is to the marketplace. I don't care what you're doing. If you can throw a regulation out there that'll block the competition for big meatpacking, big retail, big food in general, they're all over it and they're going to keep doing it.
A friend of mine in Bryan, Texas, his son got into drugs, and he got to selling drugs, and he went broke. And Tudor said, I don't know how in the hell you go broke selling drugs, but Cody did it.
Are we going to wrap up here for a little bit, Mike?
You say, Adam.
You know, I think I appreciate the conversation, Mike, and I think, you know, the entire industry really does owe you a debt, because I do think you're one of the first ones that started screaming loud when people needed to go back and, you know, really study some of the history of it, because I think it makes more sense of where we're at and also allows us the opportunity to look for some solutions going forward. I think for me, though, what I always want to really get across to people is that this is a crisis situation. You know, the cattle industry is very fortunate that we weren't the first. You know, we've already seen it happen in poultry, we've seen it happen in hogs, we've seen it happen in the dairy industry. Now it's cattle. They are trying to vertically integrate us. They are trying to move us. You know, if you're not a large producer, and when I'm talking large producer, I'm talking 100,000 head feed yards and 2,000 head of mama cows. If that isn't your operation, they're going to put you out of business if you don't become involved and you don't become active in these issues right now. I agree wholeheartedly. We've got to break them up. You know, there's no way that you can have that kind of monopoly control. One thing we didn't talk about today is the very clear and obvious national security issue that provides us with it. You know, it's a huge concern. I think in the last year and a half where we've seen COVID and we've seen these broken supply chains, you know, we saw for the first time maybe in a long time in this country empty grocery store cabinets and refrigerators. I think people need to be scared. You need to be spooked. You know, if we don't get these things fixed, we have some real liabilities that we've invited into this country. And then also those of us that enjoy living in rural America, that want to raise our families here, you know, the game's almost over. And if you don't understand how commodities are related to cattle, I'd sure like to visit with you, but you know, you're not going to have opportunities to sell your corn to if there's no cattle producers around. You know, more than likely that big feed yard that you've been dealing with is going to find someone else to buy their corn from, because they're going to start doing just like every other industry. They're going to start pushing down on what they're going to pay. I think we are at a state where you need to become involved with organizations, and if you're already involved with an organization, you need to understand what the policy of that organization is and what their lobbyists are lobbying for. And if it's not something that you agree with, then you need to quit supporting those organizations. Everyone has a voice, everyone has a talent. If you're able to write letters, write letters. If you're able to make phone calls, make phone calls. I know that there's a lot of cattle producers that don't feel comfortable in a situation like us where we're sitting here on this couch. If that's not where you feel comfortable, you probably feel comfortable talking to your neighbors, talking to your friends, talking to the people that you spend money with. Where is your feed guy at? Where is your sale barn owner at? Where is the guy that you went and bought a fancy livestock working chute from? Those folks need to be involved. They need to be supporting the organizations that you support. We can't continue to work against our own self-interest. And with that, I really do appreciate the conversation. Mike, if you want to go ahead and end us up here.
Yeah, Adam, I just want to see us adopt policy that puts more people back in rural America. We need to fill these schools up again in our rural communities where the best educations occur across anywhere in the country. We need more people growing food, producing livestock, multi-species, diversified farms again. And in order to do that, we've got to rebuild our food system. It's been destroyed by monopoly power of a handful of meat packers and retailers and food service companies. Companies like ADM, talk about a criminal record. We've got to get these folks out of our lives, and we've got to rebuild back from the soil new farm and ranch communities that are prospering and getting a fair share of what consumers are paying for their food. Everybody wins. Diets get healthier, foods get more affordable, we get more sustainable and more resilient. Thank you for having me here.